Christoph Simpson. I'll be doing this week's update for lands, covering the dates from May 22 to May 28. So I'll be covering four news items just for general current affairs, as well as two developments within our organization. The four news items will be the Jamaica Railway Corporation's plans to start transporting students in September, the Prime Minister Andrew Holness recommending that underutilized public assets be made available to the private sector, the party that was held at Rick's Cafe and Grill, and the funeral or memorial service that was held for Kamina Johnson's father and the controversy that it caused. The two developments in our organization will be around just the general topic of organizing and why it is becoming more important and our efforts to show the importance of it, as well as a project that we've been working on that we call the Communal Production Project. So let's start with the current affairs, the news items. So the Jamaica Railway Corporation will start transporting students in September, assuming all goes well and the conditions of the pandemic don't obstruct this plan. It's a good idea if it works out to be efficient in terms of running costs. The idea is to have trains transport students from Old Harbour to Spanish Town and from Linstead to Spanish Town, and then JUTC buses would take the students from the train in Spanish Town to their respective schools. And since JUTC routes run into Kingston, it's assumed that they would be taking students into Kingston as well. Because a lot of people who go to school and even a lot of people who work in Kingston live in St. Catherine, including in Linstead and Old Harbour. If better land planning, just better land development was being done over the past few decades, it could even be useful to have trains be part of public transport, as in general, not just for students. We should be investing more in mass transit, and we should be looking at better models for houses than these fully detached cookie cutter type things with the really small yards. But the yards are big enough that people are spaced out, and so many people rely on cars. The traffic situation coming from Portmore before the expansion of the roads and so on. Um, we really should take a look at land development and take a serious look at transportation. So this is a good move, but I mean, there's a lot more to be said that um, we have to analyze and speak on and decide how we're going to go forward. So in the future, we hope to see more investment in mass transit for public transport, so that not only students but general people like average members of the public, general working class people, can get to and from work without necessarily having to own a car. And people already take public transportation in different forms, but again, taking a taxi or a bus is different from having like high capacity mass transit. So public transport already exists, but specifically mass transit options don't really exist here right now. The second news item is Andrew Holness and his suggestion to make public assets available to the private sector if they're being underutilized. So he says that the government and government agencies have a lot of land and buildings that aren't really being used. So they're just sitting there, not really benefiting anybody, as in the government isn't using them. And they could be freed up to be used by people who would actually like make productive use of them. Now, generally, this is a good idea, as in on its own, it's a good idea when you think about, yes, you have these buildings sitting there, you have small businesses and so on looking for places to use, and there are limited options. Land is very pricey. It's difficult to find a place of business. That's one of the biggest challenges right now. Land, not only for business, but for housing as well. So, where ministries, state agencies and other public bodies own buildings that are not being made available to the private sector, it's really like just a waste. So We can agree on that, but there's more to be said, and there is a big limitation with his position. So, firstly, from what he's saying, he's really only concerned about making these public assets usable for businesses, as in for profit businesses. Um, there is no mention of making them available for, say, youth clubs or community associations or grassroots movements, social clubs, and so on. And we're concerned about that. In other countries, you have public buildings available for these types of bodies to use, because you have a lot of types of bodies that serve um, good purposes socially, and they're able to get land and buildings to use. Here, it's not so easy. For a movement or people's organization, any group of people who voluntarily associate with each other, for them to find somewhere to use, they have to basically have some rich sponsor or know some landowner and get permission from them. So if you don't have links to somebody who is rich already, and your movement is mostly a working class movement, you're not going to be able to easily find space and so on to dedicate just to using for the movement and so on. So that in itself is a problem. Like, we're not looking beyond the private sector and business and how we can just turn this into a profitable asset. Community association or a union of a certain type of worker students may not be able to find money to buy off a piece of land from the government or to pay rent to use a building that a government body owns. So those who'd be able to take advantage of this might not even be the small businesses. It might be big businesses that have big money that can buy this up. So we need to look at that. Also, it's not only the government and public bodies that are sitting on unused land and assets and buildings. The private sector is also doing this as well. For you have a lot of people who own land just for the sake of speculation, owning land and empty houses, just waiting on value to go up so that they can resell it in the future. So that land isn't necessarily being used or being put to use. Downtown, before the recent efforts at what they call rejuvenation or restoration, has had a lot of buildings that have actually been unoccupied by any business or any residents. There's nobody using them or living in them, nothing being done with them. They're just sitting down there, taking up space and being unused. So people bought up and sat on these properties, waiting on value to go up, sell them off to people who are going to develop them into something else. And, I mean, the private sector invests in land speculation. This is no secret. Now, in some countries, and one country that's an example is Venezuela, even if land was privately owned and it's not being used for anything at all, much as anything productive, um, somebody could come with an idea and present it to the government and decide that they're going to take control of the land and put it towards productive use. So that's what Andrew Holness is saying people could do with government land. But what about super rich people who are hoarding land, not doing anything with it, and just holding on to it for speculation? I mean, the same things he's saying about government land being underutilized, the privately owned land that's being underutilized, it has the exact same effect. So we have to critically look at that, and also remember that we're a movement of the left, we're socialists. So if your first reaction to this is, "Oh, private property rights," remember that that is not really our biggest concern. The way we see it is that Andrew is just putting a spin on the real big idea that this isn't about making underutilized land and resources available to small businesses, but rather it's about privatizing more public assets. So more of this land and assets that are publicly owned will end up in the government. It will end up in the scratch that. More land and assets that are government owned will end up in the hands of the private sector. That is how we see it. And not the small businesses, but the same big players that are hoarding money on land would have the opportunity to buy up this from the government. Because if there's any bidding process or anything, they'd be the ones to win. They're the ones with big money. They could come with an idea, and the idea could just be to take this land and rent it to other people. So they could be doing rent seeking, just being a barrier between who would actually be using the land and the government that is offering to free up this land. Now, on to the other two current affairs items, just briefly. These have caused a lot of social media outrage, and with good reason. You've heard Andrew talking about corner shops causing COVID cases to rise, right? Now, tourists and uptown people get to have this big party in the grill, and what? Not much until social media outrage makes the government say, okay, let's close this place down for a week. Like, what? When regular Jamaicans are having parties, is oh no, is ghetto people causing COVID to spread, blah 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 blah, and people are cheering on the police pushing these people into van backs. And you think I'm going to do that to uptown people, or you think I'm going to do that to the tourists? Them? You're not going to hear that tourists and uptown people are the ones causing COVID cases to rise in the same way that I talk about people who need to go to the corner shops, or in the same way they talk about average Jamaican people who want to party. Anyways, it's very evident who this government tries to pander to, and it's very evident who this government says, okay, we'll use state violence towards them. It's two different set of people, two different Jamaicas. And Andrew himself said it. It was funny he was saying this with a picture of Siaga in the background, where he's talking about the haves and the have-nots. But the very basis of their politics is serving the people who are already rich and basically not caring about the plight and conditions of people who are not rich. And the issue of Kamina Johnson Smith and her father's memorial service is similar. There's this big hypocrisy. Um, from pictures, you could see that there are more than 30 persons at that memorial service. Now, no more than 15 persons are supposed to be at a funeral, according to the government's rules. And this had more than 15 persons. Now, what the government said is that this wasn't a funeral because the casket wasn't in the building, so it's a memorial service. The casket being in the building or not doesn't really make a difference. To like, people are still gathered in there, in the building, the living people. Anyways, they said the limit for a memorial service is the same as a regular church service, and that the limit is 30. But it's still more than 30 people were there, from the pictures at least. So again, blatant hypocrisy. And then the government is coming and telling us foolishness, and we don't want to hear it. We really don't want to hear it. We don't care. Can anybody go and say, oh, this is not a funeral, this is a memorial service, the body isn't here, and then it's treated like the same as the state one was? And I don't care if this guy used to be the ambassador, and I don't care if it's Kamina's daddy. I really don't care, and many others don't care either. If you care, that's on you, but many of us really don't care. The limit should be observed, and if they themselves won't observe the limit, why should anybody else? What kind of leadership is this? This isn't leadership. This is just them saying, oh, these are the rules that we're setting for you. They're not leading. They're not going towards what they want us to go towards. They're telling us to go towards something, and they're living a completely different life with a different set of rules. Anyways, both of these topics have generated a lot of like outrage among people. And outrage now has become very cyclical, like it goes in cycles. A new issue comes up, people get outraged. Another issue comes up, people get outraged. And I mean, you're getting outraged at the same set of people making decisions you don't like. But at what point do we stop getting outraged and decide that we want to do something? And I'm not repeating the old stale line, oh, we need to hold the government accountable. We need to hold the government accountable. A government that doesn't care about us isn't going to make itself accountable to us, right? There aren't even mechanisms in the system available for us to really hold the government accountable. The things that we want the government to do, there's no incentive for them to do them. So us whining and making it clear what we want to be done doesn't really do much. And the things that we don't want the government to do, there's no disincentive for the government to say, okay, we're not going to do that. So, if we want to influence the behavior of the government, we have to become organized as people. We need to create social movements, create political movements, create organizations, create associations, and actually organize. A lot of gains were won in Jamaica by workers organizing, by the labor unions organizing. I mean, the two political movements, well, the two political parties that exist today were a product of that. That's how they have power now. So if you have a problem with how the government is being run, you need to build power. We need to build power as people. So we've been trying to get this point across in general, and people have become more accepting of it. People have been repeating our points. People have been referring to stuff. We're working on a document internally, and Lands is made up currently of 7 different groups, and the different groups have been discussing this document, this draft. So very soon we'll be releasing something that we can say, okay, this is what we mean by we need to be organized. This is how we know when we'll be organized, and this is where we need to start, right? Because we're not pretending that we're great and organized already. We're saying in general we see ourselves as a part of Jamaica that isn't organized, and we want that part of Jamaica, including ourselves, to be more organized. So we have started, but we're not yet where we want to be. And we also want to get other people to start on the same path, because other people who should be organized may not necessarily fit into lands or want to be a part of lands, anyways. So we're going to be talking a lot more about the importance of getting organized and how to get organized. So please look out for that. So that's one development within the organization. The other development is on what we call the communal production project. Now, food security became a big topic during the pandemic. Well, since onset of the conditions brought about by the pandemic. So, people are saying, we need to start growing more stuff in our backyards and start more community gardens and whatnot. So, a lot of people within lands have been interested in that idea already. We actually had a successful garden going at the Venezuelan Institute for Cultural Cooperation in New Kingston. They just allowed us to use their land. There are no terms or conditions. They allowed us to use the land, and we're able to plant up some stuff. We planted up some onions that didn't go well. We planted up some sorrel that went well. And we're going to move from the planters that we had and actually just use the bigger yard space. But they lost control of the building because of sanctions against Venezuela. They can't send money to Jamaica to pay the rent for the building. So we don't have that garden anymore. But people are going to start gardening in their backyards and starting community gardens. But there are a lot of things around why it wouldn't make sense to just grow things in your backyard just for the sake of growing things in the backyard. And looking at agriculture in Jamaica in a broader sense, because food security isn't, can you grow things in your backyard? Food security is a national thing. Looking at things in a wider sense, we notice that there's a lack of agro processing in general, and we've spoken about this in our election document. And the private sector isn't really interested in investing heavily in agro processing. So we are actually developing as an agro processing facility essentially. Now, we don't own any big land that we're going to be able to use to do this. We're developing machinery that will tie in with other machinery that we will buy. And we're going to develop production chains and ideas that small businesses can use and that farmers can use. In times that farmers have a lot of surplus, they'll be able to use the machine so that they can set a price and be like, okay, we don't want to sell this for less than this amount of dollars per pound. So let's just turn all of this into flour or into some dried whatever. You can dry fruits. You can turn any starchy thing into flour. You can make flour from banana, plantain, potato, cassava, yam, um, breadfruit. I mean, people have breadfruit dropping off the trees and spoiling in the backyards. They could be turning a lot of breadfruit, even young breadfruit, into breadfruit flour. So that's the type of thing that we want to promote now. So we added agro processing to the as an element of our communal production project. So the communal production project is going to have backyard gardening, community gardening, agro processing, and some other stuff like community waste management. There's much more detail, like outline of our plans, that we've really kept inside, and we're going to keep the details inside for now. Where we'll articulate them in the future. Right now, it's just really a dense topic to just let out everything on somebody. So we're going to summarize and articulate it better in the future so you understand what we're doing. But we're making some progress in that direction. So we just wanted to share that. So no, we're not just meeting and talking politics. We're actually attempting a project, and we are even going to engage the government. because the agriculture ministry has been doing some good work, and we want to engage rather we want to engage farmers. So yeah, please look out for this project as well. One limitation of lands and one of the reasons we started this weekly update is that a lot goes on inside lands that doesn't really get communicated outside of lands. So we hope to be strengthening our external communication soon. Until then, you just pick up bits from these weekly updates. You could join lands. You don't have to be a full member. You could just participate in our meetings as an observer. So you could register as an observer if you want. And you could demand information from central leadership and the central bodies and so on. So, being an observer, you join one of our 7 groups and you just participate in meetings. You say what you want to say, you ask what you want to ask, and that's it. So, thanks for listening. Have a lovely week. Um, Stay on your toes. Try to keep government on its toes. Again, I'm Christoph Simpson. I'm in Lands. Peace.